you're probably going to write a lot of words you don't end up actually using to find your narrative voice. Lack of voice was my biggest issue on my first book. I queried that thing to over 100 literary agents and had maybe a handful of full manuscript requests and 0 offers. The agents who were kind enough to give me more than just a form rejection all had similar comments. The plot was tight, the premise was unique, but I just couldn't connect with the characters. That book had a large cast and it was multi-POV, and as the rejections started to roll in, I started to realize how similar all of my characters sounded. There was nothing in my writing to distinguish one character's chapter from the next character's chapter. And there was nothing to make any one of those characters sound voicey, original, or unique. I knew I needed to work on the voice thing, but I had no idea how. So I put that book aside and I started a brand new project. I was really excited about the idea, but I was still nervous about the whole voice thing. This new concept was middle grade, whereas the first book I queried was young adult. So middle grade was new for me, and I decided to start by reading a middle grade novel that had just come out that was getting rave reviews specifically for its voice. It was Savvy by Ingrid Law. When my brother Fish turned 13, we moved to the deepest part of inland because of the hurricane and of course the fact that he'd caused it. I had liked living down south on the edge of land next to the pushing, pulling waves. I had liked it with a mighty kind of liking, so moving had been hard. Hard like the pavement the first time I fell off my pink two-wheeler and my palms burned like fire from all of the hurt just under the skin. But it was plain that Fish could live nowhere near or nearby or next to or close to or around any largish bodies of water. Water had a way of triggering my brother and making ordinary, everyday weather take a frightening turn for the worse. I have a vivid memory of reading that opening page for the first time. It wasn't like I had never read a book with a strong voice before, but this was the first time I was really looking for it. And because I was reading for voice specifically, these opening lines just smacked me right between the eyes. I felt as if I knew Mibs, the main character, immediately. This big-hearted girl with a southern drawl who has a lot of feelings and they run big and deep, and she loves her family, but she does have a little touch of resentment. Phrases like a mighty kind of liking and all of the hurt just under the skin and near or nearby or next to or close to or around stood out in particular because those are really distinct turns of phrases that other characters would probably word a little bit differently. So my very first book, the one that did not land me an agent, was written in third-person past tense with multiple points of view. When I finally started writing this new book, feeling like maybe I understood this whole voice thing a little bit better, I made the choice to write it in first-person present tense with one protagonist. In retrospect, I honestly don't remember if I chose first-person present specifically to be the opposite of my first book, or if it just worked out that way, but I know I definitely decided I needed to just have one protagonist to focus on so I could find that specific narrative voice. But I do think that doing that, making that switch, if you always write in third person, maybe just try writing in first, just as an experiment. You can kind of give your brain a little jolt and maybe figure out something new about your narrative voice. So this second book, my middle grade, it ended up getting me 2 offers of representation. I dug way back in my inbox, this was 2010, and found the opening pages that I attached as a sample of my writing when I queried these agents. When Nita first told me the 3 laws of ghosts, she was making curried lentils and honey buttered naan. The smell of coconuts and the hot sunshine pouring through the kitchen window made her words sound even nuttier than usual. The first law of spooks, she said. My stepmom is British, so she always says spooks instead of ghosts. She also calls chips crisps and french fries chips, and if that's not weird enough, I've even heard her call a cookie a biscuit, which is just wrong. Biscuits are either the buttery things that hold your scrambled eggs or the things you feed your dog when he finally does a trick right. They are not the magical hot gooey pieces of heaven that come out of the oven oozing chocolate chips. Or I guess in Nita's case, chocolate crisps. Anyway, the first law of spooks, she said, is they prefer the rainier, gloomier, chillier parts of the world, which is why there are so many in London. She dropped a handful of bright yellow powder into the pot of lentils. But they exist everywhere, Ruth. Where there's people, there's ghosts. It's only a matter of how many. So this definitely did have more voice than my very first book. I remember when I wrote these opening pages, I could picture Ruth, this frizzy-haired, really chatty little 12-year-old girl, telling me this anecdote about her stepmother in her own way. She was doing the talking and I was just typing down what she said. Now, full disclosure, when I signed with my agent and we went on submission with this book, she gave me a hefty revision letter, and one of the first notes was to cut that whole parenthetical ramble about cookies and crisps and all of that stuff. And it was a good note. That ramble really doesn't belong, but I had to write it because that was one of the first things I wrote, and it helped me find Ruth's voice, her way of talking, and her style. 40,000 words later, I knew Ruth and I had her voice down, and I could, with my agent's help, go back and really make sure it fit her voice while cutting out all the unnecessary filler stuff. My point is, you're probably going to write a lot of words you don't end up actually using to find your narrative voice. Now, let's talk about emulating authors that you admire. Something that comes up often when I teach teen workshops in particular is whether or not it's okay to write fan fiction. And I say, oh my God, please write all the fan fiction you want. I think that is one of the maybe best exercises anyone can do to try to become a better writer. If you wanted to be great at jazz trumpet, I would say, yeah, mimic Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie until you find your own sound. Imitating the greats or just your favorites, authors you admire, that's one of the best ways to learn. That said, don't fall into the trap of trying to force yourself and your voice to sound like what you think your genre is supposed to sound like. I think there's some misconceptions about almost every genre, whether it's like adult psychological thrillers or YA dystopians or middle grade contemporary. Sometimes writers think that there's a certain tense you're supposed to use, a certain perspective you're supposed to use, and just a certain way it's supposed to sound. For example, some fantasy authors have a natural formality to their voice, and it fits the expectations a lot of fantasy readers have for the genre. This is Tolkien's influence, and it is vast and everlasting. But if you don't have a natural formality to your voice, then it's just not gonna work. And there's no rule out there saying that a less formal voice won't work for a high fantasy. A great example is The Last Dragon Slayer by Jasper Fjord, which doesn't have the traditional fantasy formal narrative voice at all, but that's what makes it so unique. It looked set to become even hotter by the afternoon, just when the job was becoming more fiddly and needed extra concentration. But the fair weather brought at least one advantage. Dry air makes magic work better and fly farther. Moisture has a moderating effect on the mystical arts. No sorcerer worth their sparkle ever did productive work in the rain, which probably accounts for why getting showers to start was once considered easy, but getting them to stop was nearly impossible. Voice is perspective and tense, wrapped up with identity and personality and postulates and observations mixed with metaphors and similes and word choice and style and sentence structure. No wonder we have such a hard time defining it. It's as complicated as DNA and as unique as a fingerprint. Earlier this summer, I taught a teen writing workshop, and on the first day, one student told me that she specifically wanted help that week on her voice and descriptions. So I got to a point in her story where her main character had just arrived at this flower shop where she was going to be working for the summer, and she was dreading this job. The student had really skimmed over the description of the flower shop itself. I think she called it an ugly two-story brick building. So I told her, this is an opportunity to work on your descriptions and find your narrative voice at the same time. And I gave her 3 different examples to give her an idea of how 3 different protagonists with different voices might describe this ugly shop. The flower shop looked like a rusty old birdcage whose occupants had flown the coop ages ago, leaving nothing but dirty newspapers and a slightly foul odor behind. The flower shop was more like a house of horrors, with its chipped red paint and the broken white bars on the windows like the jagged teeth of a monster. This place was the ugly Christmas sweater of flower shops, a mishmash of patterns and colors and textures so tacky it made you a little bit dizzy if you looked at it too long. I asked her which of those 3 sounds most like the way your protagonist thinks. I think she went with the House of Horrors and she rewrote it a little bit and made it her own, but there's no one right answer here. Any of those would work. It just depends on who your protagonist is. On to today's writing workshop activity. If you watched this video, you'll know I'm having a little bit of a moment with Rachel Aaron's book 2K to 10K. Her method has been helping me not just write a ton more words every session, but it's also improving the quality of my first drafts. To sum it up for you, I've started writing a tell version of a scene scene and then going back and writing the show version. Meaning the first time through the scene, I'm just telling myself what happens and I'm not worried about voice or anything at all. It's like a stream of consciousness kind of ramble. And I think yet another benefit from this method is that it's really useful in helping you find your narrative voice. Because by the time you get all the telling out of the way, when you go back to show, the mechanics of your scene are already laid out. You freed your brain up from having to worry about all of that. So now you can just focus on voice. So here's what I want you to do. Go to an online character generator and get a quick profile. Then go to randomwordgenerator.com and generate 5 random words. I will link both of these generators that I used in the comments below. So you've got this random character, you've got these 5 words. Without thinking too hard about it, I want you to free write just the opening of a story with this protagonist and use these 5 words. This is just an opening. You don't have to worry about premise or plot. Just see what comes out and make it all telling. Write for like 2 minutes. Get maybe half a page. That's it. Once you're done with this free write, go back and start reworking this for style, for prose, and for voice. I hope that by getting all of the telling out of the way, you're going to be able to really focus on finding that random character's voice in those opening paragraphs. And if this exercise works for you, try it with your current draft. Tell a scene and then show a scene, and use that showing time to really focus on honing the voice and finding the style and the tone that you want. And keep me updated in the comments. I would really love to know if this works for you. And tell me any other tips that you've heard that have helped you to find your narrative voice. Now, next Monday, we're going to be talking about the line between world building or just brainstorming in general and procrastination. How do you know when you've gone too far? So if that sounds like something that is interesting to you, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know when that video goes up. That's it for this workshop. If you found it helpful, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like button. As always, feel free to share your writing in the comments below because I would love to read it. And I will see you guys on Friday with another vlog. Until then, keep writing.